Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
I'm Ingrid Ackermann, an undergraduate studying environmental systems engineering.
And we have with us here today Professor Patricia Bromley from the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and Karina Kloos, the Director of Research and Scholar Programs at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And Karina and Tricia, you guys just ran a conference on civil society and sustainability. And Ingrid, you were there. Ingrid, why don't you kick us off? What did you find most notable about the conference?
Most notable. I really enjoyed the discussions of the overlap of the public and private sectors, and how sustainability is becoming more of a force in each. Before this conference, I don't think I had a strong take on what civil society honestly concretely meant and how it related to sustainability. I would have given an amorphous answer. But after this conference, I now feel like I understand that we have so much of the science figured out, and we know the actions that need to be taken to address many of the issues with climate change. And I, after this conference, feel like civil society is the bridge between the science and the action. I think there's many bridges, but I think civil society is one of our strongest pathways to help changes occur in society. There's lots of levers in there. Of course, it's complex, but I learned a great deal. So that was my biggest takeaway.
Oh, interesting. And Karina, let's turn to you first. As you're in your position, you see quite a bit of the new activities that are going on and the new research in philanthropy and civil society. For our listeners, what does it mean, civil society? It seems like that's a very big umbrella.
It's a great question. It's one that we actually still dissect every year at our workshop that we kick off at the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Some people think of it as everything in between the family, outside the markets, and outside government or the state. So you can think of it very broadly as occupying a lot of that space. Often people associate civil society with nonprofits or non-governmental organizations, and that's certainly part of it. But any, associational life, community groups, which came up in our conference, really comprises civil society. So the kind of interactions that happen from everyday people coming together and organizing or interacting in those spaces.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. And Tricia, in your position, given your research on institutions and on sustainability, how do you see the intersection of civil society and sustainability? And then we'll just go ahead and let you guys jump into what went on at the conference.
That sounds great. Thank you both for having us. It's really exciting to be here. So thinking about that intersection, for me, the studying organizations and institutions, civil society is the bridge between those because it includes, as Karina mentioned, both the formal and informal kind of sectors of society, especially the ones that are outside the market, although those lines blur as we see a lot today. So I think of institutions very broadly as having these informal kinds of dimensions as well. So things like patterned social norms would be part of this, in addition to the formal organizations.
Oh, interesting.
Sure. So do you mind talking a bit more about some of the key highlights from the conference? Maybe a paper that stuck out to you or a conversation that was particularly impactful?
Yeah, I mean, this maybe goes beyond what you're saying, but the people in the room and the structure of the conference, I think, set the tone of, what we think of sometimes as civil society as the ability of different groups of people coming together. So we kept this relatively small, about 30 to 35 participants, very interdisciplinary from an academic perspective. We also had several different people in the room that come from working from organizations like NRDC, environmental volunteers, et cetera. And so having some of those voices in the room, as well as some of the academics who themselves come from the world of civil society. We had someone who had spent about 15 or 20 years of her career working for a conservation organization, turned academic, and I think really leans into those roots. We had somebody else who, before graduate school, worked for environmental and other types of nonprofit organizations, and is really fascinated by the kind of undercurrent of civil society and just kind of the hidden contributions to civil society in this space. So for me, one of the big takeaways was, wow, those motivations and those experiences that really contributed to the tenor of the conversations and the discussions that were really vibrant. And every single time we had to cut off the conversation and move on and collect questions and move, to break time because there was so much engagement around them.
That's interesting. Is there an example of a conversation that's notable in your mind?
Well, the panel that we had on the energy transitions, so looking at siting and where microgrids are going to be placed, or where windmills, et cetera, are going to be placed. I think that our keynote speakers started out and laid the ground in a very wonderfully broad, sweeping way and provocative way too. And one of the things that I remember stood out for me is him saying, just because somebody doesn't want that in their backyard doesn't mean they're a climate denier, and just kind of unearthing that complexity. And there was a whole panel on that to really appreciate where you see community organizing. We had a paper, and unfortunately, our presenter wasn't able to join. She had a sick kiddo, but around anti-coal activism, but also this space that nonprofits occupy of they want to support the communities, and often they're trying to help our efforts around mitigation, so transition to clean energy. But they're also thinking about environmental justice and the kinds of organizations and communities that are affected by those spaces. So it was really the complexity of that. And we had someone in the room who's an entrepreneur in the energy space. So I think he in particular found that particularly enriching conversation he doesn't usually get to have in his everyday.
So that's a fantastic example. And I'm wondering if maybe there's another example that we can kind of really see how civil society is especially relevant to sustainability and how they're deeply intertwined. Do you mind sharing another?
Sure. That's a great question, Ingrid. And I actually want to go back to your original point because for me, also one of the key takeaways that sort of ran throughout the conference was this link to like public policy, say, or formal structures of government. So I think I've been reflecting a lot since of many of the conversations around activism and government policy regulation and how these things come together in ways that are unique to the civil society space. And I kind of had come to thinking of there are maybe like 4 unique roles for civil society. One of them being this role of providing the link between individuals and government, but to come together in a collective sort of way. So advocacy, activism, shaping awareness, but also kind of providing a source of information for government in a more coherent way than just a single individual writing to a lawmaker, say. So sort of an aggregating function. But there were lots of these kinds of trends I saw throughout the conference of ways that civil society provides that intermediary sort of function in a really unique way, distinct from what government can do and distinct from what markets and for-profit businesses can do in terms of contributing to sort of positive sustainability outcomes.
Yeah, Patricia, could I follow that answer up? I just this morning in my undergraduate sustainability course, the students and Chris Field and I, the professors, were talking about the problem of regulatory capture. And just for those listeners, it's just fancy talk for when powerful interests, typically large business organizations, have such a big effect on the regulatory process that they essentially capture it and represent their own interests as opposed to having the regulators regulate those businesses. And one of the things those undergraduate students came up with was the question about whether civil society more generally, they didn't use that term, but it's what you're talking about, whether civil society more generally can can sort of take back the regulatory functions of government and the other the sort of institutional functions of government from special interests. Do you mind if I ask your view on that?
Yeah, no problem. So absolutely, civil society plays a role in doing that. There's no firm answer for you of overall, can civil society outcompete sort of business interests in regulatory capture? But we certainly see successes. And maybe the siting, so the microgrid siting paper you mentioned is one of them. It's a place where there's the intersection of a lot of powerful forces, but the overall picture was one of massive increase over time in microgrids, which help provide alternative sources of energy when they are renewable, which they often are. So it's a little nuanced, but civil society plays a big role in helping communities understand the value to them and in sort of counteracting the energy, the big energy company interest, and actually in working with the energy companies as well to come together in partnerships to promote these microgrids as a new kind of energy.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so transitioning away from that, no pun intended with the energy transition, there was quite a bit of talk as well about financing and philanthropy. And I'm wondering if one of you could speak about perhaps the trust models that were discussed between the US and Europe, or one of the other financial instruments talked about at the conference.
It's a great question. I was going to say to what Tricia was talking about and to your question, Bill, is even the role of the nonprofit sector ends up being kind of complicated on who can sort of influence the direction of outcomes. And this is a little bit of a transition, but then I'll come back to the questions. That one of the conversations I thought was really interesting was Professor Chris Rea, and he was talking about the fiscal politics around environmentalism and sustainability, and had these really interesting, kind of conceptual ideas and some empirical data around how when nonprofits are a little bit more, I don't know, we say contentious and different ideologies, we see more funding going in those directions, and yet the liberal nonprofits and environmental nonprofits haven't been bringing up those issues with the EPA, and we've seen these drastic decreases in the funding. Tricia, maybe you can help me out, and do you remember kind of teasing apart what some of those differences were? Because I want to just highlight that, civil society nonprofits, we kind of think is, again, of having this sort of one direction of making things better, but it's complicated. And then similarly, I wanted to connect it back to nonprofit versus corporate. We're kind of blending, as Tricia was saying. And so there were some really interesting models about that kind of blending.
Yeah, so the paper that was most directly relevant for me was the paper on nonprofit ownership of corporations, with some massive corporations like Novo Nordisk, I think, being one of them. So Patagonia is the one in the US we know, but we have a scholar from Europe visiting us who was describing that this kind of ownership structure that's been in the news here as this innovative new thing for Patagonia is very common in Europe. So he had done some research showing that in the European context, at least, having nonprofit ownerships, even of very large firms, improved various kinds of sustainability outcomes. Interestingly, in the US context, there was a lot of pushback from our audience, who are nonprofit scholars and civil society scholars, about the risk for self-dealing. So it's largely against the law in European style formats to have that ownership structure in here. Part of why it's rare is that the tax setup of it is not as favorable. And it was instituted that way in 1969 to prevent self-dealing. And our participants reacted quite strongly, feeling like, actually, if we give the same tax incentives here to have that corporate structure, it would result in a lot of negative outcomes.
Can you quickly define self-dealing for folks?
So just worried that the profits would not go to support sustainability outcomes. Say instead they would go to enrich the people working in the foundations.
I
or
see.
That kind of relationship.
Okay.
Nepotism, maybe loosely.
Sure, a real moral hazard
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I found that panel so interesting because I was like you, Ingrid, like really drawn in, and this is exciting. As an outdoor enthusiast, I'm a huge fan of Yvonne Chouinard and Patagonia, and I think there were some different levels of criticism. One was, this kind of concern that we carry within the United States, and you can understand why there'd be some concern around that for whatever reasons that I'm not knowledgeable enough to speak to, but that you don't have the same concerns. Another critique that someone brought up was, well, is this a way for them just to avoid taxes? And someone Trish and I both work with over at PAX, Rob Reich, has done a lot of work on, the nonprofit society basically pulling money out of tax circulation, that would help government solve these problems. And I forget the number, but he was quick to react and say those 12 corporations, support something like 20% of the tax contributions in that country. So I think there's some complexity here too. What really struck me, and like I said, there were such vibrant conversations I didn't get to ask, but the two examples are Patagonia and Hershey's. Mm-hmm. And I was so intrigued by why Hershey's. I mean, those aren't the two organizations I put in the same room. There's a lot happening around cocoa, I know, and more sustainability, this or that, but they weren't the obvious ones. And so I wish I'd had more time, and/or David was with us now, to unpack that, why Patagonia and Hershey's.
That's interesting. As I recall, I think Hershey's was a family business for many years. And of course, that's true for some of the examples in the European context as well, where essentially elite families take on a role of being quasi-public figures in many ways, looking out for the public interest. When Rebecca Henderson at MIT talks about purpose-driven organizations, often those are the kinds of organizations that get, brought up as examples.
Well, and I asked a question at the conference because I was curious why someone would put a company like this into this structured trust. I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but apparently if there's no heir to pass a company to, that can be a strong incentive for an individual to create this sort of structure. And that's much of what we've seen in Europe. So it's fascinating to see it starting to transition to the US, but limitations and the public policy that goes along with it. Yes. Were there any other topics at the conference of particular interest in your mind, or that there were any important takeaways for you?
Sure. So a couple of other things that came up for me just in terms of trying to think through what the unique role is for civil society. One was about the level of innovation that goes on and social innovation in areas where there isn't a clear profit motive to be gained or way of making profit. So lots of kind of research and universities. So Stanford might be a key example of a nonprofit organization that would be linked to kind of innovation and research and knowledge generation. But that just being a central role of what this sector does in this field. Another was the kind of filling needs, like gaps that are left behind between market governments. So really more niche areas with some interesting discussion around the extent to which nonprofits stepping in and filling needs, sort of leftover unmet social needs, say from climate migrants or something whose social services aren't being filled. So nonprofits might come in and do that, to the extent to which it's actually absolving governments of their responsibilities. So that's a sort of tension of whether it's an appropriate role for them versus more the advocacy, public policy role you said, of maybe what they should be doing is pushing governments to fill those needs. So that was another interesting tension that came up.
Yeah, and I think related to that, power. I mean, a few people talk about power. I think some of the people are especially motivated on a personal level to think about environmental justice and community voice in these processes and how are they being brought in. And there's so many different power balances, in that, and including a real question of, even when we're looking at coming back to the energy transitions and renewables, what are the impacts on those communities? There's something that, I think sometimes we consider sort of the NIMBYism of, that sounds like a lovely idea for many of us listening to this podcast, of that sort of transition, but there's sort of real lives and people being impacted. And so how to grapple with that as our, as a country, as a global society, as well as scholars, like how are we engaging those voices, and how are we bringing those voices, and what kind of scholarship are we doing on that and with those communities to really bring light to these sustainability issues?
It's just such a big issue that it's easy for us to sometimes lose sight of the fact that we cannot leave behind those communities who wouldn't be adjusting to a transition if there wasn't some kind of institutional mechanism to help that change happen. I know Michelle Anderson at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Law School has looked into some of those stories in different parts of the United States, but of course it's happening all over the world as part of our adaptation and attempt to mitigate climate change. We're moving in very different directions in the economy.
Yeah, so something empirically that came up across a couple of the papers that I hadn't known before, maybe this is common knowledge to others, but that there was a much bigger focus among civil society organizations in what the global south, in quotations, on adaptation, and a much bigger focus in the north on mitigation. And this sort of reflects power dynamics in the world to a large extent. That was quite fascinating to me to see in sort of mission statements and programs, this big split in the types of approaches.
No, it is. It's just a fascinating divide. There was a long time, as many of our listeners might know, but there was this long time where if you did work on climate adaptation, people in the sustainability movement would almost look down on that as if you were throwing in the towel.
Right.
But you go to Pakistan, you go to the streets of Manila, you go to the coast of Chile, and the list goes on. The change is here. And so adaptation is something that has to happen in many of those areas. And so I'm glad to hear that we're looking at adaptation as well as mitigation.
Yeah, I would say it's something of a privileged position to say, well, let's, and we know that from the conversations too in the COP, the various rounds of COP that we have. I mean, those kind of tensions in the global north, global south. One of the things that was interesting is we had Gabrielle Wong-Perotti, who's also at the Doerr School, join, and I know some of her work is around adaptation and with communities right around here. So even while there tends to be this kind of global south, global north, really appreciate the work that they're doing with the Future Bay Initiative and elsewhere around thinking about some of our own communities right here in the Bay and how they're impacted not just by changing levels in the ocean, the water, and how that's going to affect communities along the water, but also air pollution and the kind of internal or inside and outside kind of dynamics of air pollution. I know they're rolling out a huge study, and really appreciated kind of coming back to how you do this research. I think that people weren't quite sure how to engage with her presentation because she was trying to say that let's do RCTs in the messy context of these communities. And people were like, well, what was the outcome of the RCT? But I think she was really trying to get people just to appreciate that when you think about the internal validity and external validity of a study, basically, RCTs, randomized control trials, sometimes are thought of the gold standards of a certain type of research. And that really gives us clear ideas of what's going to be most effective, what kinds of interventions, what kinds of messaging. But the external validity is how relevant is this, in these different contexts. And so I loved what she offered on some of the trade-offs that you get, but really what you gain from that, both from understanding what's happening in the context to make sense of your data, but then the relationship you build with the community for uptake of those research insights and having kind of that real-time action context, I think is what she referred to engage with the kind of research findings we hope as an academic community we're offering to the world.
That's just fascinating. Thank you. And at this point, I want to ask both of you for one final comment or finding that you want to share out in this podcast.
So I'd just say something that I'd mentioned before. I was looking back, we invited all of our presenters to share a bio, and we asked them, what motivates you to do this research? What are some of the outcomes from the convening? What's your secret skill and favorite fictional character? So we're trying to have a little bit of fun and build up the community in this space. But one thing that really struck me is, what motivates people to do this research is really personally driven as well as academically driven. And I just find it so enriching when you see those coming together in ways that doesn't detract from, the strength and quality of the scholarship and really, can motivate that scholarship and also speak to, people saying, I'm not motivated to do anything else, or this is an all hands on deck moment and we have to respond in these ways. And at the same time, there were such rich, theoretical and conversations and empirical questions about the different data and different research design approaches, et cetera. And so I found that combination to be really encouraging. And I love seeing that happening in academia more and more.
Yeah, I think echoing some of that, my only final comment would be our goal in organizing this was really around community building, because we deeply believe in the importance of this issue and the distinct role for civil society in solving sustainability issues. So just to invite people to reach out to us if they're interested in getting involved, and that's academics of all levels, students, faculty, postdocs, but also practitioners. As Karina said, it was really valuable as part of our conference to have that link between practitioners and academics.
And I want to say thank you so much for really taking the conference and running with it. You two ran this conference in a bit of a non-traditional way that allowed for so much interdisciplinary discussion and roundtable comments and feedback. And I think that you just set a really nice precedent for as we move forward and kind of iterate on this conference series. So thank you so much for your intentionality and effort in doing so.
Well, thank you so much to both of you and the whole SIBES series, the Business School, the Doers School, for putting this on and supporting this work. And we heard from our keynote speaker, who's a veteran, that there's a real opportunity for field building and continuing this conference every year and bringing this community together. So a huge thanks to you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Karina Kloos, and thank you, Patricia Bromley. And on behalf of Ingrid Ackermann and the rest of our colleagues here at Stanford University, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doers School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.